In a world obsessed with stardom and glamour, very few actors become legends, not just for what they did on screen, but for who they were behind it. One such man was Dan Blocker, known to millions as Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza. But there was so much more to him than the cowboy hat, the hearty laugh, and the strong right hook. Behind the rugged charm was a soldier, a scholar, a teacher, a family man, and a gentle giant whose legacy still quietly echoes across American hearts. Dan Blocker didn't just enter the world, he announced himself. Born on December 10, 1928, in the tiny Texas town of Dalhart, he weighed a staggering 14 pounds at birth, setting a record in Bowie County that held for decades. Locals didn't forget it. His arrival was talked about in barbershops and grocery stores like folklore. His birth certificate even had a typo, mistakenly recording him as Bobby Dawn instead of Bobby Dan Davis Blocker. But names wouldn't define Dan, and neither would size alone. Though he was born a giant, it was the gentle that made him unforgettable. When he was 6, the Blocker family moved to O'Donnell, Texas, still reeling from a tragedy: the death of Dan's older sister, Virginia, who had passed from pneumonia at just 11. Dan was only 5 at the time, and though he rarely spoke of it, that loss left a lasting impression on his soul. His father, Ora Shack Blocker, opened a small grocery store in town, and the family lived in the back of it. From an early age, Dan was hauling feed sacks, bagging groceries, and charming customers with his deep voice and warm smile. By age 10, he already stood 5 feet tall and weighed 105 pounds. By 12, he was 6 feet and 200. He boxed grown men in exhibition matches on Main Street just for fun, and won. Stories spread of him lifting farm equipment, and even a car off a man trapped underneath it. Whether true or exaggerated, no one doubted he could have done it. But for all his brute strength, Dan was remarkably thoughtful. Teachers noticed his curiosity and compassion. He loved reading and had a surprising sensitivity that contrasted his hulking frame. His dad used to joke, "He's too big to ride and too small to pull a wagon." But Shack also knew, deep down, that Dan was something rare, a mountain with a soft heart. That balance of brawn and tenderness would follow him for life. It shaped the way he acted, the way he fought in war, the way he fathered his children, and, eventually, the way he became a legend not just on screen, but in the hearts of millions. His family moved to O'Donnell, Texas, when Dan was just 6, still grieving the loss of his 11-year-old sister, Virginia. The Blockers ran a small grocery store and lived behind it. By the 5th grade, Dan was bagging groceries and hauling 40-pound sacks of cattle feed. He was already bigger than most kids, and soon, bigger than many adults. By 12, he stood 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds. They even used to rope off Main Street just so Dan could box older boys, grown men even, and never lose. At 12, he was enrolled in the Texas Military Institute. His parents hoped it would shape his size into strength, his strength into leadership. That same school had once trained General Douglas MacArthur. By the time Dan hit college, he was a natural on the football field, playing for Hardin-Simmons University, then transferring to Sul-Ross State Teachers College. It was there, backstage in a school play, that something shifted. They needed someone big to carry fake dead bodies for arsenic and old lace. Dan volunteered and found his calling. The football player suddenly changed majors, from physical education to drama. That's the part of the story no one expected. The bouncer turned actor, the tank of a man with a tender voice. Dan Blocker was a walking contradiction in the best way possible. He could silence a bar room full of rowdy cowboys with just a stare. But moments later, he'd be backstage delicately adjusting props or helping fellow actors memorize lines. He had depth, warmth, and an uncanny ability to connect with people, whether on stage or off, that simply couldn't be taught. After graduating in 1950 from Sul-Ross State Teachers College with a degree in speech and drama, Most people expected him to pursue sports professionally. Football teams and even boxing promoters approached him. After all, he was 6'4", over 250 pounds, and built like a freight train. But Dan said no. He didn't want a life defined by fists or touchdowns. He wanted something more soulful, something creative, something real. So he packed up and headed east to Boston to join the summer stock theater circuit. It was thousands of miles from West Texas and light years away from his comfort zone. He didn't know anyone there. He had no connections, just raw talent and grit. In Boston, he worked around the clock, performing in new plays each week, memorizing lines on the fly, changing costumes backstage in the dark, and sharing cramped living quarters with other struggling actors. The pay was modest, but the experience was invaluable. He wasn't just learning how to act, he was learning how to endure, how to adapt, and how to bring authenticity to every role, no matter how small. Then, life took a sharp turn. In late 1950, as the Korean War escalated, Blocker received his draft notice. He didn't hesitate. He didn't pull strings. He didn't ask for special treatment. He answered the call, trading his stage makeup for an M1 rifle. The gentle giant who once played dead bodies on stage was now saving real ones in combat. He would go on to serve with courage and distinction, but the war would forever mark a dividing line in his life, before and after. What started as a dream of the stage had been put on hold. But even in the trenches of Korea, Dan carried that same mix of strength and soul, a performer's heart in a soldier's body. And that blend would define the rest of his extraordinary journey. War changes people. For Dan, it revealed everything he was made of. The army struggled to even find boots that fit his massive feet, size 14.5. But once on the front lines, he became the Big Un, a respected, fearless leader who was wounded while rescuing comrades. He served as a master sergeant with the 45th Infantry Division, earning a Purple Heart and numerous medals. He led missions through hellish terrain, Hill 200, Pork Chop Hill, and always came back for his men. When he returned from Korea, he didn't come back as a cowboy. He came back as a hero. Yet, Hollywood wasn't calling just yet. Dan returned home, married his college sweetheart, Dolphia Parker, and taught English and drama in Sonora, Texas. Imagine being a sixth grader learning Shakespeare from the man who'd one day play Hoss Cartwright. Even as he taught, he kept his passion for acting alive. A family trip to Los Angeles, meant to be a vacation, changed everything. Dressed in full cowboy gear, Dan made a phone call from a booth, completely unaware he was being watched. A talent scout saw him and knew that's the guy. And just like that, Hollywood opened its doors. Dan's early roles weren't glamorous. He played a space goon in Outer Space Jitters, a Three Stooges short. He was billed as Dirk Blocker. He did bit parts in Gunsmoke, Have Gun, Will Travel, The Rifleman, and Zorro, usually cast as the silent, strong enforcer. But one role stood out, Hognose Hughes in Maverick. It was his first taste of a part that let him be both tough and funny. And then came 1959. NBC was looking for something new. A Western, yes, but with heart. A father and three sons on the Ponderosa Ranch. Each needed to bring something unique. For Hoss Cartwright, they needed someone big, lovable, gentle. A man who could end a bar fight with a bear hug and make children laugh with a grin. Dan walked in, 6'4", over 300 pounds, hands like dinner plates, but spoke with warmth and kindness. The casting team didn't just find Hoss, they found the soul of the show. From 1959 to 1972, Bonanza became an institution. At its peak, it was the #1 show in America, reaching 50 countries and nearly 20 million homes every week. Dan Blocker starred in 415 episodes, the second most of any cast member. His portrayal of Hoss wasn't just comic relief, he brought nuance, intellect, and heart. Dan insisted on it. He played Hoss with a quote in mind: "If there's any kindness we can show, let us do it now, for we will never pass this way again." Kids loved him. They wrote him letters. One simply said, "I wish you were my dad." That letter stayed with him. Not the ratings, not the fame, but the impact. Still, the show was grueling. More than 30 episodes a season. Long hours, tight costumes, blistering heat. Dan often passed out on set, but kept going. His health began to decline, but he never stopped smiling. He was still dad at home, bedtime storyteller, gentle giant. Behind the scenes, Dan stayed humble. He opened a chain of Bonanza steakhouses, made appearances, shook every hand. He acted in films like Come Blow Your Horn and Lady in Cement alongside Frank Sinatra. Director Robert Altman even wanted him for The Long Goodbye in 1972. Dan was about to finally break free of typecasting, but fate had other plans. Dan went in for routine gallbladder surgery on May 13, 1972. He never came out. A blood clot reached his lungs. A pulmonary embolism took his life. He was just 43. Bonanza was never the same. The ratings dropped. The chemistry changed. NBC canceled the show months later. His co-star, Michael Landon, said he could always cry on cue. He just thought about Dan. Dan Blocker was buried not in Hollywood, but back in Texas, next to his family, under a simple stone that read, "B. Dan D. Blocker." No glitz, no spotlight, just the way he would have wanted. His legacy didn't end there. In O'Donnell, Texas, a statue of Dan stands tall. A room in the Heritage Museum is dedicated to him. A mural on a barn greets travelers with his image. Dan Blocker Avenue winds through Henderson, Nevada. Dan Blocker Beach hugs the Malibu coast. His presence remains, not in reruns, but in reminders of kindness. His son, Dirk Blocker, was just 14 when Dan died. One day, he was making silly car commercials with his dad. The next, he was walking behind a casket, surrounded by cameras. Not for a movie, but for the real-life farewell to the man he loved most. For years, Dirk stayed silent about the pain. He didn't talk about the grief, the pressure, the confusion of losing a father the world thought it knew, but only Dirk truly did. Now, at 67, Dirk is finally speaking, and what he shares isn't the story of a celebrity's child basking in fame. It's the story of a kid trying to find his identity in the giant shadow of a man loved by millions. He remembers how fans would mob them in public, wanting autographs, photos, or just a glimpse of Hoss's boy. But to Dirk, Dan Blocker wasn't a TV cowboy. He was the dad who once dressed up in costumes to make his kids laugh. The one who never missed a bedtime unless he absolutely had to. The one who still packed their lunches even when he was starring in one of the most watched shows on Earth. As Dirk grew older, he didn't run toward fame. He carefully stepped around it. He carved out his own career, landing roles in shows like Black Sheep Squadron, The X-Files, and Matlock. But his most well-known role came decades later as the hilariously offbeat Detective Hitchcock in Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Audiences loved him, but what they didn't know was how much of that character's warmth, silliness, and stubborn heart came straight from the father he lost too soon. Beyond acting, Dirk also became a teacher, an author, and an advocate for emotional honesty. After decades of quietly navigating his own path in Hollywood, he stepped back from the spotlight to explore something more personal: writing. His children's book, Master and the Little Monk, isn't just a sweet story. It's a deeply symbolic reflection of his own emotional journey, the tale of a lonely boy who finds wisdom and peace through the quiet mentorship of an old monk resonates with something Dirk has carried for decades: the voice of his father guiding him, even in silence. Dirk has said that writing the book helped him confront emotions he had long buried. Losing Dan at 14 left a wound that fame and success couldn't cover. The world saw Hoss Cartwright. Dirk saw the man who grilled burgers in the backyard, helped with homework, and held the family together with gentle authority. In many ways, the little monk wasn't just a character, it was Dirk himself. And through that story, he found a way to reconnect with the father he lost so young. But Dirk's tribute to his dad hasn't stopped with the book. In recent years, he's opened up in interviews and public appearances, sharing stories that fans never heard about what Dan was like when the cameras were off. The quiet generosity, the goofy sense of humor, the discipline wrapped in tenderness. Dirk doesn't speak of Dan Blocker, the actor. He speaks of Dan Blocker, the man, who was more concerned with being a good father than being a famous one. What stands out most about Dirk today is how he's carrying his father's legacy, not through imitation, but through intention. He's not trying to be Hoss 2.0. He's showing the world what it looks like to grow up in the light of a good man and then to turn that light outward. As he tells these stories now, it's not for attention, it's for healing, for memory, for gratitude, and for all the kids who grew up watching Bonanza, wondering if Hoss was really that kind. Dirk's answer is simple. He was more than that. He was Dad. Dirk has written books, taught school, and chosen a quieter path. He didn't chase fame. He chose character roles and stayed grounded because that's what Dan taught him. In the end, Dan Blocker wasn't just Hoss Cartwright. He was the dad who made it home in time for bedtime stories, the veteran who saved lives on frozen hills, the teacher who read Shakespeare with a booming voice, the actor who brought America together every Sunday night, and the gentle giant who never let his size outweigh his soul. Dan Blocker's life was filled with contrasts, the kind that made him unforgettable. Here was a man who could carry a wounded soldier on his back through enemy fire, and then sit down at night to read Winnie the Pooh to his kids with the same intensity. A man who could crush a bar brawl with one arm, but refused to raise his voice at home. His presence was massive, yes, but it never demanded the spotlight. Instead, he used his size to protect, not intimidate, to embrace, not overpower. Even his fame didn't harden him. Dan was the rare celebrity who refused to treat his fans like distractions. He'd take pictures, sign menus, answer letters, because he remembered what it was like to be the small-town kid stocking shelves in the back of a grocery store. He never let Hollywood change that. One co-star even recalled that Dan would often carry the crew's gear himself if someone was falling behind. A millionaire actor hauling cable on set. That's who he was. And in a moment that most people don't know, during the height of Bonanza's fame, he quietly paid for a fellow actor's medical bills after learning they couldn't afford treatment. He never asked for credit, never wanted the story told. But that's the kind of quiet grace Dan Blocker walked around with. So next time you see an old Bonanza rerun, don't just smile at Hoss's jokes. Look a little closer. See the man behind the vest, the war hero, the teacher, the husband, the father, the friend, the man who stood tall, on and off screen, because he never forgot what mattered most: kindness, honor, family, and a heart as big as Texas.